What happens when a king finally stops protecting his own son? When years of patience collapse and the royal family that stayed silent through scandals, interviews, Netflix deals, and memoir drama suddenly decides to cross the one line everyone believed they would never touch, because that is exactly what happened the moment King Charles signed the unprecedented order stripping Harry and Meghan of their royal titles, a decision that erupted across the monarchy like a shockwave, shaking the institution at its core and marking the end of an era that began with hope, romance, and global fascination, but slowly decayed into resentment, conflict, and division. And while the headlines focused on the dramatic moment Charles finally acted, the truth behind this explosive choice is far more complicated, because insiders say the decision wasn't simply the king's reaction, but the final move in a quiet internal war driven by Prince William's influence, political pressure, collapsing public trust, and a monarchy trying desperately to survive modern scrutiny. And all of it began months earlier, long before the public heard a single whisper, when palace corridors were filled with discreet conversations about whether the king could continue tolerating the situation, because Harry and Meghan were no longer just former working royals living a private life in California. They were building business ventures, entertainment projects, brand deals, and corporate filings using the prestige of the titles they walked away from, using Duke and Duchess of Sussex, like premium branding on projects that had nothing to do with royal duty. And for a monarchy already under pressure to modernize responsibly, this created growing embarrassment. But Charles, still a father trying to maintain some thread of peace, hesitated for as long as he could, clinging to the idea that reconciliation was possible. Yet the pressure around him never stopped building. And behind the scenes, the strongest force quietly shaping this moment was Prince William, who had grown increasingly firm that the monarchy could not appear weak, inconsistent, or afraid to enforce expectations, especially when it came to preserving the dignity of the crown. And according to multiple insiders, the real turning point came during a tense private meeting where William finally confronted his father, telling him directly, "You can't be king and be afraid to upset people who already left." A statement that hit Charles emotionally, not just as a monarch, but as a father, because William wasn't simply expressing frustration, he was making a demand, one rooted in conviction, responsibility, and a desire to protect the future of the monarchy he will one day lead. And while Charles hoped diplomacy could fix things, William insisted that without consequences, the institution would continue being used by people who no longer served it. And the final trigger came when Meghan reportedly used her Duchess title in a business-related document that reached officials and immediately raised concerns about commercial exploitation, and that document landed on the desk of someone who alerted the palace, causing a ripple of alarm inside royal offices. And within hours it reached Charles, who realized that if he didn't act now, Parliament might, because at that very same time, the UK government was quietly preparing a bill that would allow the removal of titles from non-working royals, a list that included Harry, Meghan, Andrew, Beatrice, Eugenie, and others. And Charles, terrified of the monarchy appearing weak or out of control, chose to act before the government could step in, because a king losing authority to Parliament would be humiliating and damaging on a scale the monarchy simply could not afford. So, with pressure from William, warnings from Parliament, and growing public frustration, Charles finally signed the order, but palace insiders admit openly that although the signature was his, the strategy belonged entirely to William, marking the moment the future king stepped into his power more visibly than ever before. And while the UK reacted with shock, debate, and a wave of relieved public commentary, the emotional explosion happening in Montecito was even more dramatic, starting with Meghan, who woke up to find the title that shaped her entire global persona had vanished, because for years she had built her brand on the image of being a modern duchess. A woman who married into royalty, broke tradition, moved to America, and created a global lifestyle identity. And losing that title overnight sent her team into full-blown crisis mode, scrambling to reevaluate upcoming projects, partnerships, branding strategies, even documentaries and business deals that relied heavily on the Duchess of Sussex identity. But instead of major Hollywood players rushing to support her, there was an odd, uncomfortable silence, because insiders in Los Angeles were already beginning to question whether Meghan's influence without the title would command the same attention or prestige, and some projects were quietly paused, delayed, or reconsidered, with executives wondering if the royal shine had finally faded. And while Meghan fought her battle from a strategic and branding perspective, the emotional collapse hit Harry far more deeply. Because for him, the title wasn't just marketing, it was the last remaining thread connecting him to the institution that shaped his childhood, his identity, his sense of belonging, and according to those close to him, Harry called Charles directly after hearing the news, pleading for reconsideration, asking for time, insisting that removing the titles was unnecessarily humiliating, especially since he believed he had not fully severed his connection to the monarchy. But Charles reportedly responded with the coldest line Harry had ever heard from him: "You made your choices, now I must make mine." And that single sentence shattered Harry emotionally, leaving him withdrawn, somber, and overwhelmed by the feeling of being the spare all over again. Not just symbolically, but now officially outside the structure he once thought he could return to. And while that emotional drama unfolded, the public conversation spiraled in another direction toward Prince Andrew, because many questioned why he hadn't been punished sooner or more aggressively. But palace insiders insisted that Charles use this moment to send a message that rules now apply universally, that privilege is not permanent, and that the monarchy is finally moving toward accountability, though ironically, Andrew himself was reportedly relieved by the shift, preferring a quiet, hidden life over public visibility, while Harry and Meghan unintentionally became the center of global discourse again, but this time, not as glamorous rebels now as former royals whose power and influence were visibly shrinking, and the consequences extended further when it came to Archie and Lilibet, because Meghan had always maintained that royal titles were her children's birthright, a symbol of heritage and legacy. But with their parents' titles removed, the automatic royal privileges the children might have inherited largely evaporated, sparking fury in Meghan, who accused the palace of stripping her children's identity. Yet inside palace walls, the explanation was simple: titles follow duty, service, and contribution, not mere bloodline. And as the dust settled, the internet detonated with hashtags like #King Charles finally acted and #Buy Sussex trending worldwide. With the UK broadly relieved, the US deeply split, and general fatigue growing among Americans who felt exhausted by the constant drama, while comedy shows began mocking the situation, turning the once glamorous Sussex story into late-night entertainment. And amid all of this, the one figure who emerged as the quiet victor was Prince William, who maintained public silence but privately earned immense respect inside the institution for demonstrating decisiveness, long-term vision, and a willingness to do what even Charles hesitated to do. And palace insiders say this moment symbolized a shift in internal power from Charles to William, proving the future king was capable of protecting the crown's integrity. And by the time the smoke cleared, Harry and Meghan were left facing the reality they never imagined. No more duke, no more duchess, no royal shield, no institutional prestige, just Harry and Meghan. Two individuals navigating a world where their brand depends entirely on their actions rather than their titles, and what started as a powerful love story that captured global hearts ended as a lesson in consequence, identity, and the uncompromising truth that royalty is not a costume you can put on when it benefits you and criticize when it doesn't. And while this feels like the end of the Sussex era, insiders warn it is only the beginning of the fallout, because the monarchy has reset, the boundaries are redrawn, and the world is about to witness what happens when a royal chapter closes, but the storm it created keeps unfolding.